Well, welcome everyone to our seminar on targeting fossil fuels, the political and economic case. My name is Professor Robin Eckersley. I'm the Head of Political Science here at the University of Melbourne, and it's my privilege to chair today's session, or at least start the ball rolling. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and acknowledge and pay respect to their elders, past and present. This event has been organised by the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, in particular the Climate Transformations Cluster, and also the University of Melbourne's Australian-German Climate and Energy College. I'd like to introduce our two guest speakers today. Over there we have Fergus, who's worked on the governance, ethics and politics of climate change for more than a decade, initially as a lawyer in Melbourne and now as a researcher in London. From 2014 to 2015, Fergus was a policy analyst and research advisor to Professor Nicholas Stern at the Grantham Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he's now in the final year of a PhD project supported by John Monash Scholarship. He's an associate of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, and he's an alumnus of the University of Melbourne. And here we have Richard Dennis, who's the chief economist and former executive director of the Australia Institute. He's, of course, a very prominent Australian economist, author and public commentator, and he's a former adjunct professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University in Canberra. His Wikipedia entry said that he was born in 1900, which makes him 118 years old. And I think this explains why he's such a national treasure. He has the learning and the wit to call out bogus economic justifications for bogus public policies. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Fergus and Richard. They'll talk for approximately 40 minutes, and then Sangeetha Chandra Sakaran will be stepping in to play a role to manage the Q&A. And of course, Sangeetha is the Deputy Director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute and Head of the Climate Transformations Cluster. Over to you two.
Well, thank you, Robin, and thank you very much to the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute and to the German-Australian Climate and Energy College for hosting us today. It's great to see such a big audience, particularly for a morning session. So, serious discussion of climate change at the international level, as many of you will know, began really in the early 1990s. And for the first 2 decades of that serious discussion, climate change governance and a lot of climate change activism was framed around a model that you might call treaties, targets, and trading. It was all about trying to get a big, legally binding global treaty that forced countries to meet a particular emissions reduction target. And it was seen that the best way of achieving those targets would be through an emissions trading scheme that would ensure that the targets were reached efficiently, or at least through some form of carbon pricing. It was a theoretically elegant solution, some would say a beautiful solution. And it was one that was championed by a largely technocratic global elite of scientists and economists, and supported by a largely professionalised set of international NGOs in the environment movement, who sought to persuade governments to act on climate change on the basis of scientific and economic rationality. Climate change throughout this period had wide public support and concern, but it was shallow. People didn't prioritise climate change, and they certainly, at least not in very big numbers, did they take to the streets to demand urgent climate action. So as a result, this technocratic elite and this professionalised global environment movement were not particularly politically powerful. Time after time, policy initiative after policy initiative, international conference after international conference, they were systematically politically outgunned by the fossil fuel industry. This paradigm of climate politics reached its nadir at the Copenhagen summit in 2009, where the structure of climate politics collapsed under the weight of the ambition of what they were trying to achieve in this treaties, targets and trading paradigm. But from the ashes of Copenhagen this decade, what is emerging is a new wave of climate politics that targets fossil fuels. It began with the activist movements, with activists of soon after the Copenhagen conference. A key sort of clarion call was the environmental activist and writer Bill McKibben, whose, I think, 2011 article, Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, in Rolling Stone magazine, was what sparked the divestment campaign, the fossil fuel divestment campaigns on college campuses, initially in the United States. And you then had a series of high-profile infrastructure proposals, such as the Keystone XL pipeline and, of course, the Adani coal mine in Australia, where a new brand of directly targeting fossil fuels through activism gradually became sort of the norm in environmental campaigning. And today, I want to argue the logic, the case behind targeting fossil fuels through activism. And I'm going to argue that it helps to mobilise grassroots support for climate action, to delegitimise the fossil fuel industry, and to help build global moral norms against fossil fuels. And in recent years, we've started to see more policies and even international cooperative platforms targeting fossil fuels. And Richard is going to talk about the policy and international cooperation aspects of targeting fossil fuels. So how do we mobilise around climate action? And what is it about targeting fossil fuels that facilitates the grassroots mobilisation through climate activism? So this is a question we know from, there's a lot of sociological theory on social movements, and we know that social movements are built through effective and resonant framing of a problem. They're built through accruing resources and building alliances, and through sustaining movement activism, sustaining participation throughout the long political battle of whatever the issue may be. And so I'm going to argue that on each one of these dimensions, that targeting fossil fuels, as opposed to targeting greenhouse gases or climate change per se, is an effective way of mobilising grassroots activism. So let's start with framing the issue. So when the issue is framed in terms of climate change or greenhouse gases, when the object of attention is greenhouse gases, we're focusing on something that is an odourless, colourless, invisible gas. It's something that is caused by the unintentional, as a byproduct of the unintentional actions of billions of human beings doing normal everyday activities. And greenhouse gases cause one problem, a problem, climate change, that is complex, that is difficult to understand, and whose effects are temporally and spatially distant from its causes. Little wonder it is difficult to mobilise people around that issue. When it comes to fossil fuels, however, we're dealing with commodities that are, at least in the case of coal and oil, perhaps slightly less so gas, but commodities that are tangible, that are clear, simple and readily understood, and that cause multiple problems at multiple scales, not just global climate change, but also local air pollution, local land rights issues, local water pollution. They cause economic volatility, public health problems, and they're associated with a range of governance problems around the world that range from quid pro quo corporate government corruption to outright systematic human rights abuses. Focusing on fossil fuels also shifts the connotations around the agents who are responsible from this diffuse, complex problem that we all cause to something that brings into focus the agents who are disproportionately responsible for causing climate change, i.e. the fossil fuel majors. And it singles them out for disproportionate causal responsibility and moral blame. And in this way, helps to create an enemy out of a problem that is otherwise, as I said, the incidental byproduct of everyone's actions. And because of the way that they're targeting a product that causes multiple serious harms, and they're singling out particular agents for their disproportionate role. Campaigning around fossil fuels has a different kind of underlying normative logic to it than the campaigns around climate change. The campaigns around climate change, as I mentioned, were underpinned by a kind of utilitarian cost-benefit type calculus, right? Emissions trade efficient market-based schemes. So it was this sort of logic of efficiency. Whereas the fossil fuel campaigns are built on a kind of logic of appropriateness, right? This idea that fossil fuels are just inappropriate, that they are problematic, that they're toxic. And also by targeting the moral agents, the agents that disproportionately cause climate change, it builds on a kind of virtue ethical paradigm that targets the character of the agents who are associated with fossil fuels. And so for all of these reasons, it's like ticking all of the boxes of all of the things that you want to do as a social movement to mobilize people, right? Fossil fuels pretty much tick all of them, or tick a lot of them, whereas greenhouse gases and climate change tick pretty much none of them. And in terms of framing, I think this framing on fossil fuels also helps to delegitimize the industry and by undermining the industry's symbolic power, its discursive power, its power to shape ideas and norms. Right? We know the fossil fuel industry has way more instrumental, financial and structural power, but it's more vulnerable when it comes to this more symbolic and discursive aspect of power. And so directly targeting fossil fuel companies and fossil fuels forces the industry to defend itself, either to defend itself in moral terms, which are often patently ridiculous, as with the coal industry's global campaign that coal is necessary to sort of feed the world's poor, and certain other coal industry campaigns that are sort of mobilise a moral rhetoric, but that's easily parodied. So they're either forced to sort of defend their practices in moral terms, or they're forced to double down on sort of barefaced instrumental power. And as we've often seen with the increasing sort of connections between the state and the fossil fuel industry, the deployment of the security agencies everywhere from Australia to developing countries to suppress protest against fossil fuels, and the sort of increasing criminalisation of environmental protests. And that also just further saps the industry's legitimacy. So I've talked about framing, but I mentioned that social movement activism is also about accumulating resources and building alliances. And here too, I think targeting fossil fuels has an advantage over targeting greenhouse gases. I mentioned that fossil fuels cause multiple grievances at multiple scales. This is a real benefit when it comes to alliance building, because you can generate, you don't just activate the sort of, Melbourne-based global elites who care about climate change, maybe the Wentworth-based as well. You also tap into local grievances at the sites where fossil fuels are produced and consumed in large amounts, particularly coal-fired power stations. And so you get these surprising alliances of farmers and greenies, and in the US around the Keystone XL pipeline, this famous Cowboys and Indians march, right, where they were all concerned about local land and water impacts from the Keystone XL pipeline. So you get these surprising alliances. And then when it comes to accumulating resources, these groups at these different scales tend to have complementary resources. So the big environment groups tend to have more money, they have national level political contacts, they have media contacts, and they have international networks. But what they often lack is precisely what local groups often have. They have local networks, local connections, local legitimacy. They have resonant messages and stories with diverse kinds of people. And all of these things help to generate media attention, and they help to shift political incentives, because you get concentration of groups in particular areas with wide representation who care about a particular project or issue, and that changes electoral incentives. And then the final thing I mentioned about social movement mobilisation was the importance of sustaining participation over time. And here, targeting fossil fuels also has an advantage. So I mentioned the divestment movement and these particular campaigns against fossil fuel infrastructure. So one of the benefits of targeting these kind of small and medium-sized kind of projects is that you get so-called small wins, and small wins sustain movement participation over time. Just ask veteran campaigners of international climate politics whether that's more effective than going to the UNFCCC conferences every year and banging your head against the wall for 2 weeks and then recovering for the next 50 weeks and then doing it again. And see what helps to sustain movement participation, particularly young people, over time. So in sum, with respect to mobilisation and delegitimization, oh, one more point about that, in terms of undermining the fossil fuel industry's alliances and resources. Because the fossil fuel campaigns are sort of morally infused and arguing that the product is toxic, this also helps to disrupt some of the alliances that the fossil fuel industry relies on for both finance, in terms of banks, which are consumer-facing and have brands to protect, and also cultural institutions like museums and universities, who also have brands to protect. And the more the product gets toxified, just as with smoking and cigarette companies, the more these public-facing institutions become pressured to cut ties with the fossil fuel industry. And therefore, the more regulable, right, the more politically targetable these industries will become. So that's the case around mobilising grassroots and delegitimizing the industry. And in my last few minutes, I want to talk about how this kind of activism helps to create new, what I call anti-fossil fuel norms, right? Moral norms against fossil fuel production, transportation, and consumption. So a norm is just a standard of appropriate behaviour that's expected of an agent with a particular identity. We can think of social norms against passive smoking or drink driving, but we can also think these are also examples of moral norms. Moral norms are norms where the standard is seen as morally required of an agent. And norms are all about logics of appropriateness, right? I talked about how anti-fossil fuel rhetoric is framed in terms of a logic of appropriateness rather than a logic of efficiency. Well, that's what norms are about. Norms are about sort of deontological injunctions to do something or not to do something. And they typically emerge from civil society activism. And historically, there is a rich tradition, a rich history of activist-led prohibitionary moral norms being generated and affecting state behaviour in the international system. Think of the campaigns around and the norms that developed concerning certain kinds of unjust practices and toxic products like slavery, apartheid, nuclear testing, landmines, and even environmental cases like lead in petrol, and the CFCs and so on associated with the ozone layer. So there's a rich history of campaign-led moral norms becoming global norms against certain products and practices. And I argue that we are beginning to see the development of a set of anti-fossil fuel norms. And I want to finish by talking about how I think these norms that are emerging from civil society and from the fossil fuel campaigns are likely to spread and affect state behaviour. Because we know that when it comes to international moral norms, social movements are critical at generating these new norms, but then states are really critical when it comes to entrenching and spreading these norms. And we're only sort of at the beginning of that cycle. And when it comes to spreading norms, what is important is, well, three things really. So it's the interaction between the identities that states have and their social incentives to be seen to conform to or be legitimated by other states, and then economic incentives, which sometimes go in the other direction. And so I want to just finish by presenting a little bit of a sort of model about how we might expect anti-fossil fuel norms to spread from civil society throughout the international community. And so this is very stylized, but imagine we sort of have three types of countries. So in the green, the first countries are countries that identify as sort of progressive climate leaders. And they also have pretty strong economic incentives to do something about climate change because they're particularly vulnerable to climate change and because they don't have a big fossil fuel industry. So we might think of the Pacific Island countries. And we can expect these countries like Kiribati and their former President Tom to be what you might call a champion state, a state that picks up some global moral norm. It might be a norm against building new coal mines or a norm against new coal-fired power stations or something like that. And we would expect these champion states to then quite actively, through tactics of persuasion and through modelling, through leading by example, to convince other climate progressive states with strong economic incentives to be early adopters of some new norm. And we see that with the No New Coal Mines norm in the Pacific Islands Forum, for example. And then they might try and sort of target some other progressive climate leaders like some of the Scandinavian countries, for example. But the point is that this early stage, it's about persuasion and sort of more effortful tactics to persuade other countries to adopt a new norm. Then we get to countries that might be climate progressive, but maybe they have weak economic incentives. They might have a large fossil fuel industry. Norway would be a good example here, at least in the oil sector. And then you have also other countries that might not particularly identify as a strong climate leader, but nor do they necessarily have a big fossil fuel industry. And here is where the tactics, the sort of social influence begins to take place. Once you have a few countries adopting a norm, then others might think, well, you know, I should adopt that norm for some purposes of social legitimacy within the international community. And so they sort of start to automatically perhaps gravitate towards adopting those norms because they have the social incentives to do so. And then at some point, often it's roughly around a third of the states in the international system, you get a critical mass, and then you get a kind of tipping point effect whereby lots of countries will adopt a norm in relatively quick succession, right? Because the more think of it in sort of human terms, the more other people are doing something, the more we're likely to sort of gravitate and follow just because that is normal. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the economic incentives will go in the other direction. So if you're a remaining fossil fuel supplier and all these other countries are adopting norms to say keep their coal in the ground, then the price of coal is going to go up. And so your economic incentives to produce more of it are going to go up. So I don't deny that this is going to be an issue. But what we will see after this tipping point, I think, occur is that you have certain holdout states. You know, we might think of certain countries that want to build new coal mines, for example. We'll find that they try to hold out, but then at least what you have is you have a new source of international pressure on those countries, moral pressure on those countries to stop doing that, to stop acting contrary to the norm. And these international incentives tend to interact with the existing domestic grassroots campaign in the relevant country. So it's at the international level, these holdout states have to expend increasing amounts of political capital in order to continue their counter-normal practices. Think of Japan and the amount it has to spend to continue whaling. And then in the domestic sphere, because of the international pressure, it provides a focal point around which the campaigning community can mobilise, and it legitimises campaigners and reformers within the country who are seeking to support the norm. And so, roughly, it's in this way that I think in the years ahead, we'll start to see some global anti-fossil fuel norms having an effect at both, not just the grassroots level, but through international pressure on the holdout countries who continue to, at large scale, develop and use fossil fuels. And so now to talk more about the policy instruments and measures that might entail, and also the international cooperative platforms that we might see emerging around fossil fuels, particularly fossil fuel supply, I'll hand over to Richard.
Thanks, Fergus, and thanks, Robin, and everyone else involved in organising today. I'd sort of make a few follow-up points on what Fergus was talking about. And I think we really need to think through, I'm an economist, apologies for that. I think my profession and optimal policy design has just killed climate progress for 20, 30 years. So apologies. But we still need to kind of, learn as many lessons as we can. And hearing Fergus talking just then, I was thinking, yeah, what do we want? Optimal multinational trading mechanism that's equitable and ambitious. When do we want it? As soon as politically feasible. It just didn't work. All right, it didn't work. It didn't work. It's not going to work. So sign me up. Anyone wants to get me a global carbon price tomorrow, I'll have one. All right, all right. Do you think it's coming? Do you think that's around the corner? So the pursuit of optimal policy instruments to tackle climate change is, I think, a strategic disaster of epochal proportions, because we've invested so much of the scarce time that we had available in the pursuit of that optimal policy, whether it's domestically or internationally, and it didn't work. And we've now got far less time. And we need to understand why that is. We need to understand what, if anything, we're going to do about it. And those forums that Fergus was just talking about then, those multinational forums, multilateral forums that many of us have spent too much time in, let's be clear, the word coal is never used in them. We don't have international meetings about how we mine less coal. We don't have international meetings about how we burn less coal. We have international meetings about the abstract. Oh, we need to reduce emissions. And everyone agrees, including the coal miners. No, this is really important. They agree. There's nothing to disagree with. Yes, let's reduce emissions. Let's. How about we burn less coal? Not that way. But let's focus on what we have in common. Right, so we've spent decades focusing on what we have in common, which is that in principle, we should reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In practice, we should build enormous new coal mines. And we've never confronted the cognitive dissonance of those two things. Which is the lie? Is the lie that we plan to reduce emissions? Is that the lie? I think so. Because if we all agree the world's going to use a lot less fossil fuels, and Australia is planning at the moment to double its coal production, someone is lying. But when we talk about the abstract, when we talk about reducing emissions, we don't need to confront that. So talking about fossil fuels, which are the major cause of global climate change, is a way to change the conversation away from a very effective strategy of doing nothing, which is to never mention coal and to never mention oil. It's impolite. It is impolite in global climate talks to talk about coal or talk about oil. It's impolite. No, you talk about emissions. We focus on what we can agree on. We don't pick battles about coal or oil or gas. No, that's not how it's done. Please, I hope in question time people won't correct me on this, but that's my experience of it quite directly. So we don't talk about coal, we talk about emissions. And while we're talking about reducing emissions, we subsidise the construction of new coal mines. Right? It's not secret, is it? It's not hidden, it's not hard to spot, but we've been tricked into having the wrong conversation, I would argue, for way too long. But again, you want to get me a global carbon price? Sign me up. I'll take one. But is that all I'm going to talk about because some economic theory says that's the optimal policy instrument? No, I'm not going to do it. But it's okay. We're not walking away from, wouldn't it be good to have a global carbon price to start a conversation about other mechanisms? And let's be clear, in the history of tackling complicated policy problems, climate change is the biggest experiment in the history of policy development. Because in the history of policy development, there's never been a situation where people have said, oh, until we can get the optimal policy instrument up, we're not going to do anything. This climate change is not the first hard policy problem to be confronted by people. It's not the first hard domestic political problem. It's not the first hard international political problem. Fergus talked about whaling. Fergus talked about nuclear disarmament. Let's take a simple one, tobacco. Have you ever heard public health officials, doctors, or anti-tobacco campaigners arguing with each other about whether it is better to tax tobacco or regulate its consumption? Have you ever heard public health experts arguing about whether banning advertising for cigarettes is optimal and whether or not an optimal tobacco tax might be superior? Or do you see 30 years full court press on every available instrument, taking advantage of whatever local, national or international doors open, and then they charge through the open door and make incremental gains, and then they look for something else? The idea that if we think hard enough about the optimal climate policy and we can come up with the optimal price and the optimal targets, and then of course the optimal fairness of distribution of costs and benefits, and then we meet for long enough, we'll get there, it is ridiculous beyond my comprehension. So, I don't know how to make slides work. There we go. So this is not new, I'm saying. Like, forget climate change, just go look at the history of every other problem. And what you'll see is that when policies, and I'm focusing here on the economic policies, there's a whole kind of range of different policy approaches you can adopt. Supply side, demand side, restrictive supporting. Fergus came up with this nice little box. We use it in paper I'll talk about later. But in a nutshell, when it comes to climate policy, the cool kids have spent 20 years focusing on the demand side. Carbon taxing, emissions trading, maybe subsidies for renewable energy. Demand, demand, demand. It's all on the demand side. Sign me up. I like demand side policy. You can't think I'm not talking about it. Right. I'm not saying we don't need demand side policies, but supply side policies, when it comes to climate policy, are thin on the ground, except of the supportive variety. So we'll subsidise the supply of renewable energy, for example. Great, sign me up for that. See, I'm a really complicated guy. I can simultaneously support a demand side tax on fossil fuels and a supply side subsidy for renewables. I don't feel a need to optimise my ratio of support for those two things. I'll just take them both. But what Fergus and I are talking about is the kind of taboo of climate policy, and that is restrictive supply side policies. Why aren't we banning new coal mines? Yeah. Thank you. It's radical thought, isn't it? Because I think if the world was on a trajectory to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it would need less coal in the future, not more. Crazy, huh? See these big leaps I'm making. And if we're going to need less coal in the future, we probably need to build less coal mines. Because to be clear, banning new coal mines does not mean shutting down all coal mines immediately. See how those things have nothing to do with each other. Banning new coal mines, different to shutting down all new coal mines today. So if we just ban new ones, guess what would happen to the supply of coal over the future? It would reduce in line with what we pretend is going to happen. But if Australia, the second largest coal exporter in the world, plans to double its production, what would happen to the supply of coal? It would go up. It's as if we're bullshitting when we say we think global emissions are going to fall. Because we're actually willing in Australia literally to subsidise the expansion, not restrictive supply side. Let's be clear, we're supporting supply side policy for coal, not just in Australia, all around the world. But for decades, the climate movement barely wanted to talk about subsidies to the coal industry. Instead, they took on the political hard nut of a global carbon price. I think it's crazy. So I just want to talk now a bit about the economics. So a bit more about the economics. But again, demand side policies, tick. Richard likes them. Please don't ask me why I hate them when we finish talking today. I like them, and I like supply side ones as well. So a little bit of economic history. The first economics textbook really was written by a guy called Alfred Marshall. And anyone that's seen anything of an economics textbook's probably seen a supply and demand curve. Alfred Marshall invented that depiction of supply and demand, the X, the cross. And he was once asked whether it was supply or demand that set the price. And Marshall's answer was, that's like asking if it's the upper arm of the scissors or the lower arm of the scissors that does the cutting. All right, price is set by the interaction of supply and demand, the interaction of supply and demand. So of course, reducing demand for fossil fuels is a good idea. But if we reduce the demand for fossil fuels, if California banned all internal combustion engines, what would happen to the price of oil? Have we go. What if California stopped buying oil? The price of oil would fall. And what would a lower oil price trigger other people to do? Buy more. This is really complicated, isn't it? Right, so even if your demand side policies were effective, even if you could reduce demand for fossil fuels, in the absence of supportive supply side policy, you would actually get counterintuitive effects. Well, guess what? California is a major exporter of oil. So if all California did, which, you know, as Jerry Brown's saying, oh, let's burn a lot less oil in California, good on you, Jerry. You ask Jerry to stop producing and exporting oil, ooh, that's a bit hard. Ooh, no, if I did that, someone else would sell it. So I should sell it because I want to tackle climate change. Confused? Right, we need both arms of the scissors. So in terms of the economics of this, it's not complicated. Australia is the world's second largest exporter of coal. The economic rationale for subsidising the new rail line in the Galilee isn't simply to build the Adani mine, it's to actually build 5 new mines up there. Well, if those 5 mines got built, Australia, the second largest producer of coal, we have a larger share of the traded coal market than Saudi Arabia has of the oil market. If Australia doubled its supply of coal, it would have an effect on the global price of coal. It would push the price of coal down. That would be kind of the opposite of a global carbon price. Well, no one thinks if Saudi Arabia doubled their oil production, it wouldn't affect the oil price. So it's hardly controversial economics to suggest if someone with 20% of the world coal market doubled their production, it wouldn't push the price down. So unfortunately, you know, for whatever reason, economists and policymakers and arguably a lot of activists have just ignored the supply side of climate change. I think to our enormous peril. But I'm not asking people to make a choice between who's right and who's wrong. I'm saying go look at everyone else's history of policy reform and you'll see that they probably tried to cut with both arms of the scissors. Just finally, to take up a point Fergus made before about China, China introduced a moratorium on building new coal mines in 2015. It had nothing to do with climate change, had everything to do with China's internal politics. But the world price of coal went through the roof. It's really complicated. The world's largest producer of coal reduced their production of coal and the price went up. Do you follow that? They didn't do it out of some multilateral promise to do anything other than reduce air pollution and achieve political stability within their country. Unilaterally, the Chinese have given us a far higher global carbon price than 20 years of talking and lecturing China about how they should do more to tackle climate change. And the reason that the coal industry is doing better in Australia than people expected has got nothing to do with the market for coal. The communist state imposed a regulation on coal. It reduced the supply of coal and the price went up. And that's cash in the pocket of Australian coal producers. But most of the coal mines in New South Wales at least aren't rushing to expand capacity because actually they think in the long run that's not a great bet. Right? And they know the market's not doing it, it's the communist Chinese government bit. Just finally, there's all sorts of economics, it's quite simple here, but there's all sorts of interesting politics at play. The Port of Newcastle, in confession, I've done some work with them, I'm a former Newcastle boy. The Port of Newcastle, the world's largest coal port, has been publicly, repeatedly critical of the subsidies for Adani. The world's largest coal port is opposed to subsidising a coal mine that will never use its port. Because in a flat world coal market, if new coal mines open somewhere, guess what happens to output from existing coal mines? It's got to fall. Okay? So the people who own $2 billion worth of coal infrastructure exposed entirely to export coal aren't in the coal club, they're in the capitalism club. And there aren't many casino operators that lobby to get a new casino set up next door. Because most people understand that when you have a monopoly, you want to hang on to it. Well, when you start thinking about supply side policies, you see enormous opportunities for, frankly, divide and conquers that might not be apparent. If you ban new coal mines, you just stuffed money in the pocket of incumbents and hurt the expected profits of the new entrants. People who own coal mines are separated in their interests from people who'd like to own coal mines. It's not complicated, and I'm not saying banning new coal mines is enough. But if we don't have the policy or political power to ban new coal mines, then frankly, we're kidding ourselves that we have the political power to get a global carbon price. Thank you very much. Here's all mine Fergus, mainly Fergus hard work.
Thanks very much, Richard and Fergus, for a really thought-provoking presentation. I might just kick off by asking Robin if she has any provocateur questions to try, and then I'll have the audience.
Thank you. Well, either Richard or Fergus, how does one deal with China's massive lens overseas on fossil extraction? A lending spree which is now larger than the lending of all the other developed banks combined. Because this investment, not just the one Belt One Road investment, so also if you're making a strong and compelling case for anti-fossil fuel norm, how can one swing that campaign towards China?
Everyone hear me? Can I hear you through the microphone or I won't talk through that microphone. No, that's a great question, Robin, and I think sort of a general point and a specific point. The general point is, not to put words in your mouth, it has a similar structure to a question I was asked at the ANU the other day, which is, but campaigning against fossil fuels and targeting fossil fuels itself won't solve all our climate problems. And to which I would say, no, it might not. And I don't think either of us are saying we have all the answers. But I think what we are saying is that this paradigm of targeting fossil fuels through grassroots activism, through building global norms, through policy and through international cooperation is likely to have more chance at dealing with at least the energy aspect of climate change. Obviously, there's other aspects, forestry, land use, but it's least likely to be more effective than trying to target greenhouse gases directly through these targets and trading paradigm. The more specific answer to Robin, I think, is to sort of go back to the model of anti-fossil fuel norms that I laid out, because whilst China is doing an enormous amount on the domestic front in terms of renewable energy, both manufacturing for export and domestic production, doing a lot on electric vehicles and batteries and various other things, Robin is right to point out that there's a lot of the Chinese state, through various development banks, is financing a lot of new coal in other countries. And this is sort of a new frontier, but this is precisely where anti-fossil fuel norms could potentially play a role. And what we need really is other countries to be leading by example, to be making international statements about the inappropriateness of, in this case, the norm would be against fossil fuel financing. Already we're starting to see the multilateral development banks scale back, at least from coal financing. So the norm is beginning to develop, but we need bigger countries to essentially endorse that norm, because until China sees this sees these practices as incurring a foreign policy cost, it's probably going to continue to keep doing them. So I think that the point about we have to originate the norms from somewhere, that there's a logical process by which norms spread through the international system. And eventually, you want powerful enough states to put pressure on the Chinas and frankly the Australias of the world to conform to the norm. So what we've outlined is a political process that we think has a chance of getting there. Whether it does is really up to us.
Just quickly, I think that I agree with Fergus. Like, there's no one shot in the locker. Just like it ain't a global carbon price. Right? It's not that. But we're not saying it's this. But I think what we're saying is at least additive for other strategies. And I don't think sitting around waiting for the UNFCCC to fix it is additive to anything. I think it's dilutive. In terms of the specific question of China, look, I don't know how to change America's foreign policy. I don't know how to change China's foreign policy. Thing. But I agree with Fergus, the usual approach is to build a coalition of pressure. Now, China is very interested in extending its geopolitical influence in the Pacific. Well, the Pacific are more affected by climate change than anyone else. The no new coal moratorium has built a powerful coalition within the Pacific. Well, you know, why not go to that coalition? A coalition that China is overtly and covertly trying to influence. By the way, if Australia had any sense of foreign policy, we'd be doing the same thing. And say, well, hello, Pacific Island Network. You know, China wants to come and build ports in all your places. Australia would like to come and build something else. We're the country that supports you on your singular passion for climate change. You know, that's not all, but yeah, I think saying I take your point that China's got more than one iron in the fire, but I think central to our strategy is admitting we're losing. You know, every time a coal mine gets built, we've just got proof that powerful people aren't serious about tackling climate change. So if you want to prove that China's not serious about tackling climate change, sure, focus on that. But I don't think that means, but losing those fights is actually a way to empower people.
I'm just going to use the chair's prerogative to ask you a question around energy and finance. They're deeply entangled energy, mining and finance sectors, and the financialization of energy is deep and wide. What you're talking about has major implications for stranded assets, which then has macroeconomic flow-on effects for the states that you've identified. I was wondering if you could speak to this issue of stranded assets. And
it's great for stranded assets. The banks should love it. Adani harms every existing coal project in the world. So are there more finances for the new project or every project in the world? Right, so once you understand that new entrants harm incumbents, it's not just the shareholders, there's lenders, there's all sorts of people who actually benefit from an orderly transition. I mean, anyone with exposure to a coal mine in the Hunter should be concerned about Adani. And it's no accident that Westpac's lending principles are now a calorific content that's equal to the coal in the Hunter. Right? And the coal in Queensland doesn't cut it. And they've got effectively no new basins in their lending criteria. But they're actually protecting all of their existing loans. So again, I just think people have to not look at this industry as homogenous and instead chop it up into the composite parts. And yeah, if you're an insurer or a financer for any incumbent asset, then why on earth would you support regulatory or finance approval for a competitor?
okay, Morph.
Thank you very much. First point I really agree with, and then a point that I disagree with.
The one like at university again.
I think your points about supply and demand are really at the core of the issue, and I happen to be the climate witness in the Adani court case, Carmichael court case. I'm in Brisbane, and there was no argument about the cumulative carbon emissions, etc., from the mind, that was all agreed, but the supply and demand issue was at the end what the judge, used basically the verbatim comments from the Adani lawyers, which is, if we build Adani, nothing is going to change on the coal world market. We are not going to have any effect on the prices, and therefore we can't have any effect on consumption of coal in the end. So this is what it boiled down to. So I think that's really at the core of the issue at the moment. The one thing where I'm confused about, to say it that way, why do you need to bash international climate policy efforts in order to make another very important point? Bill McKibben's terrifying math would not exist if we wouldn't start out from the norm. We want to avoid climate change. It's 2 degrees, it's 1.5 degrees, and these are the cumulative emissions that we can afford. Therefore, the logical next step is to look at where are the emissions coming from, the cumulative emissions, and yes, we have to target fossil fuels. There's no way around it. We have to keep them in the ground. If you were devoid of that international framework and the international agreement of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, then there are certainly fossil fuel projects that have positive effects on providing electricity to those who don't have it. But it's that climate change framework that provides legitimacy to go after fossil fuels on a bigger scale. And I think there we don't do ourselves the benefit of trying to bash it in difficult international framework where 195 nations have to agree on, but they come up with something that now provides the background under which national and regional and sectoral specific action can take place. So my question there is, why do you need to bash the international framework in order to make another good point?
Well, we both might have thoughts. I mean, I think, of course, there have been valuable things done in the international framework, under this sort of old paradigm. But, think about the amount of time that was spent, think about the lead up to Copenhagen, the amount of time we spent trying to get an optimal global treaty with legally binding targets and complex emissions trading. And tried it out with Kyoto, and the sort of fundaments of the fact that climate change is important and we should reduce emissions are in the UNFCCC. They're in the treaty from 1992, and then we spent 20 years trying to get optimal. And I think our point is more that a lot of the time, energy, effort, attention that was spent trying to get optimal could have been better spent trying to do a little bit of political realism, targeting some of the things that we're now talking about.
Yeah, I agree, and we'll be being recorded here, so I'll be polite. I've been told repeatedly, one-on-one and in strategy groups with people who lead global environment groups, that it is a distraction to talk about supply, and that in merely bringing this up is harmful, what we're talking about today. Because Richard, you can't understand how finely balanced the negotiations are. Well, they're not finely balanced. Right? They're not. 20 years and we haven't got there. So I'm okay with let's do it all at once. I'm a belt and braces kind of guy. We can, again, that's what they've done with tobacco control. By the way, Japan's still whaling. Supply side restrictions have not stopped Japan whaling, but there's a lot more whales. Right? It's not perfect, but boy, it's better. So unfortunately, I agree. If I seem strident in saying that's failed, we need to try something else, I'm sticking with that's failed. But I didn't say that's failed, tools down, give up on it. I've said that's failed, let's try something else. And if you want to keep trying that at the same time, great. But when people are going to look me in the eye and say, Richard, trying to get countries to support the no new coal moratorium is harming these delicate negotiations and patterns. They're not helpful. Well, get stuck.
If I can just make a very quick follow-up to that, that's my question here, is I think what the Paris paradigm governance has kind of, it's the path that we've gone down through Paris is a recognition that it has to be past failure, and that the future has to be a more pluralistic one. That the UNFCCC is not the sole locus of global action on climate change. There is a loose framework that provides consistent moments for action, moments for pressure, you know, but really it's basically saying everyone in, non-state actors, governments, do whatever you do and ramp up over time. And in that context, there's a space now to talk about fossil fuels, at least in other contexts, which was roundly, you know, other contexts were sort of shouted down or marginalised beforehand. But Paris is kind of a recognition of pluralism, and this is one part of a pluralist strategy.
And sorry, just one last, it's a very important point, but you know, Fergus and I are working with a bunch of people who are now trying to get supply side measures recognised in the INPCs. Like actually, so that, because you know, Fergus right, post Paris, we gave up on optimal. We said, can everyone have a red hot go? You know, can everyone just do whatever you can do and promise to do it, and we'll keep track of each other's promises. And you know, we're working with academics and with countries who are now saying, great, well, one of the things I'm doing is on the supply side, and that please count. Well, my answer is, of course it should count. But there are people fighting us on that. No, there's one true path, you know, and it's just the demand side. I'm not saying that's what everyone involved in those negotiations is saying, but that's a powerful voice pushing back on.
Okay, we've got time only for one more question. Jean, we might go to Gerald after that. Can you ask the two questions together, please?
Sure. I'm Jean Blackley from Australia. I guess I'd like you both to elaborate on what path forward could be. And what I'm hearing is, well, the 3T approach hasn't worked, and looking for the optimal policies for carbon. The advantage of that solution helps with supply and demand solution. And then Richard, you talked about, I agree with your position that you have to address both the supply and demand at the same time, because of the notion that anything that happens on one side of the ledger affects the other side of the ledger. Well, that logically brings us back to a position then that you need coordinated policy and effort here, and that has to be global. That, you know, in California or Australia or China or India, any one of these countries looks to do something both supply and demand, or just supply and just demand, you've still got the issue of the other actors and players. So I guess listening to you both today, I'll come back to, so we're back to, there has to be a coordinated. So is the proposition that you're putting forward that this is a different top-down global coordinated solution, and we're going to get there by building greater social will and momentum that demands the political for a global agreement on no new coal mines, no new coal power, fossil fuel power plants? I was a bit confused that you're saying that it hasn't worked, that top-down government policy approach of a carbon price and all the costs. But then we recognise that you're your argument, which is you can't do piecemeal things with supply and demand, either on one side or just in some nations in the world.
Okay, thanks. Gerald?
Fergus, what is the frame that you're thinking about specifically? What is the frame, and what is the moral norm that you're thinking about specifically? And Richard, is there any hope of leveraging that potential fight between Newcastle and Adani to your advantage? That's my questions.
Okay, so I'll try and be quick. So on the first one, I think coordination is nice to have, but not necessary. And I think coordination will happen if we win this battle. Coordination will happen more in the later stages. So I think, you know, what I've tried to sort of say, with a sort of model about how norms are likely to evolve, is that it is initially going to be piecemeal. But we're saying, you know, you can do piecemeal policy with one or two tools, or you can add a few more tools into the toolkit and do piecemeal policy, you know, with more opportunities, more effectively. And then, you know, and I think we will start to see, we are starting to see interaction between domestic activism, government policy targeting fossil fuels, and new international cooperative platforms developing. Not the UNFCCC, things like the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which, yes, is starting with countries that don't have a lot of coal, which is exactly what you would predict from normative development. But then they'll put pressure on the next lot, you know, and so on. So it's going to be interactive, like all social progress throughout history. Eventually, we might get a nice big treaty, but we'll be a large way of the way there. Second question quickly, multiple frames. So depending on the relevant context. But I think a lot of them will sound like things like no new coal mines, no fracking in X, no gas pipelines, you know, no coal terminals in the west coast of the United States. It will depend on the campaign, but they will have a clear, concrete message that's about prohibiting some concrete thing or about, you know, divesting or about, you know, no financing for this. So it's going to be clear, concrete framing targeted at a particular agent, a particular production practice.
The second question was about the normatives. What are the specific, have you got a specific moral norm?
Well, they are moral norms.
Yeah.
I mean, you could phrase them, one ought not to build new coal mines, you know.
I would argue that you're actually talking about messages, not actually
No,
frames.
I think they are, I mean...
You're trying to deliver a message rather than a frame.
We can argue about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm doing a PhD in political philosophy, but I think that there is a normative basis in deontological moral reasoning about prohibitionary statements about what we ought not to do, and in terms of the virtue ethical attacks on the moral agency and immoral agency of certain actors. So they have normative foundations, and you can frame them however best suits. But I think they embody moral norms.
Look, coordination is one of those great words. It's very hard to disagree with how having more of it would be good. But World War II wasn't coordinated. Stalin and the US and the English fought World War II on the same side and didn't agree on strategy or tactics or what the world should look like afterwards. So, yeah, in principle, coordination, we need some of that. But we haven't got time for coordination, and we didn't have time to leave the supply side out for the last 20 years. So I'm not anti-coordination, but I agree with Ferg. I think we're just talking about using a bigger toolbox. It's a bigger problem than people wanted to admit. We've now got less time than we used to have, so it kind of follows that we need new tools because the old tools were barely capable of doing it under the old timelines. So yeah, I'm not anti-coordination at all, but it's just not at all obvious that the politics or the economics in an exporting country like an energy exporting country like Australia and the politics and the economics of an energy importing country like Japan have got anything in common. So for us to come up with a multilateral treaty that takes into account everybody's entirely different politics and economics seems heroic, and history says we haven't got there. Look, as for Port of Newcastle, look, you know, they've been a powerful voice that, you know, frankly, because most greenies don't read the Financial Review, most environmentalists haven't even heard of. But there's no doubt that their public advocacy and the economic modelling that they funded that showed that Adani would lead to job losses in the hunter coal industry was very influential, and a whole bunch of pro-coal members of Parliament in New South Wales State Parliament and in Federal Parliament. But of course, and you know, hats off to them, I've spoken at this protest, but you know, recently the climate movement were up there blockading the Port of Newcastle, something they do every year, fine, no problem with that. They could have showed up and said, do we want to agree with the Port of Newcastle and stopping Adani? But they didn't. They just showed up and said we should shut down the Port of Newcastle. You can do both.
Okay, we've run out of time. If you could join me in thanking Richard.